This was my third year running a hydroelectric dam in a remote Idaho canyon, 40 miles from pavement. Just me, the concrete, and a SCADA screen that never lied. Every night at 3:14 in the morning, Spillway Gate 4 opened itself 11 inches and closed 4 minutes later. It takes 2 keys and continuous manual pressure. I held both keys. 3 true stories from 16 years alone. The third is why the utility sealed the lower gallery. But to understand what Richard found down there, I need to tell you about the place he lived. Silver Creek Dam, a crumbling 1932 hydroelectric station dropped into a canyon so remote that GPS still shows it as empty forest. Richard was hired as the sole resident operator in 2016. His job was simple: watch the gauges, turn the 2 brass keys when the utility called, keep the gates running. For 2 years, the only thing that broke the silence was the hum of turbines and the occasional elk. Then the SCADA logs started showing something impossible. A spillway gate opening at 3:14 every morning with no command, no operator, and no explanation. The engineering team said it was a sensor fault. Richard knew better, and what he uncovered next would make him question whether he was truly alone in that canyon. Richard took the job in 2016, a former Navy machinist looking for something simpler after 20 years of shipboard life. The utility company told him the posting was temporary. 6 months, maybe a year. They just needed someone to keep Silver Creek Dam from falling apart while they figured out whether upgrading it was even worth the cost. Richard signed on thinking he'd enjoy the quiet. He'd fish the reservoir on his days off. He'd read the stack of books he'd been meaning to get through since his discharge. 3 years later, he was still there. Not because the utility hadn't found a replacement, but because Richard had stopped asking for one. Silver Creek wasn't just remote. It was deliberately hidden. Built during the Depression as part of a New Deal electrification project, the dam was jammed into a narrow basalt gorge so inaccessible that workers had to be ferried in by barge during construction. The original access road washed out in 1957 and was never fully rebuilt. By the time Richard arrived, the only way in was a 14-mile Forest Service trail that dead-ended at the powerhouse gate. In winter, when the snowpack hit, he could go 6 weeks without seeing another human face. The utility flew in supplies once a month by helicopter. Everything else he handled himself. The dam's control systems were a patchwork of eras. The turbines dated from the Roosevelt administration. The high-voltage switchgear had been upgraded in the 70s. And in 2005, the utility had finally installed a SCADA system, a supervisory control network that digitized every gauge, valve position, and alarm point in the plant. It was supposed to let engineers in Boise monitor the dam remotely. But the satellite uplink was unreliable, so Richard still did daily rounds with a clipboard, walking every gallery, logging every reading by hand. He knew the dam's heartbeat better than anyone alive. The spillway gates were the dam's pressure relief. 200 feet above the tail race, a row of 4 massive steel tainter gates controlled the flow of water from the reservoir into the canyon below. Gate 4 was the westernmost. Each gate was operated by a hydraulic cylinder that could push it open in 11-inch increments. To move a gate even that small distance, an operator had to stand at a dedicated control station, insert 2 brass keys simultaneously, turn them both within 2 seconds of each other, and then hold a spring-loaded lever for 8 continuous seconds. The system was designed that way on purpose. 11 inches wasn't much, but at full reservoir head, an 11-inch gap on Gate 4 discharged nearly 700 cubic feet of water per second. Downstream, that meant a sudden 4-foot surge on a creek that normally ran ankle-deep. The dual-key lockout was supposed to prevent exactly that from happening by accident, sabotage, or mechanical fault. Richard kept both keys on a ring clipped to his belt at all times. At night, he hung the ring on a hook beside his bed in the operator's quarters, a concrete cell just off the turbine hall. The first time the SCADA log showed Gate 4 cycling at 3:14 in the morning, Richard assumed he'd forgotten a monthly test routine. He'd been working 16-hour days, and his memory wasn't what it used to be. He made a note to be more careful and moved on. But the next morning, the same entry appeared. Gate 4 open 11 inches at 3:14 a.m. Closed at 3:18. Again, no authorization command logged. No operator badge registered. The SCADA just recorded a position change as if the gate had decided to move on its own. Richard checked the keys. Both were on his belt. He checked the control station. The lock cylinder showed no sign of tampering. He ran a diagnostic on the hydraulic pressure transducers. They tested within spec. Everything about the physical system told him that Gate 4 had not moved, could not have moved, unless he had done it himself. And yet the log insisted otherwise. Every single night without deviation, the same 4-minute cycle, the same 11 inches, the same time stamped to the second. After the fourth night, Richard called his regional supervisor, a man named Kellerman who worked out of a Boise office building and had visited Silver Creek exactly once for 2 hours during Richard's onboarding. Kellerman told him it was almost certainly a sensor glitch, old wiring, maybe a ground fault. He'd add it to the maintenance list for the next fiscal year. Richard hung up feeling like he'd been brushed off, but what else could he do? He wasn't an engineer, he was a caretaker. But here's the thing about Richard. He'd spent 2 decades in the Navy fixing things that were supposed to be unfixable. The instinct to troubleshoot was embedded in his bones, so he started staying up. He'd brew a pot of coffee at midnight, pull a chair up to the control panel, and watch the SCADA display like a hawk. The first several nights, nothing happened. The gate stayed firmly at 0. He wondered if his presence had somehow interrupted the anomaly. Then on the 5th night, at exactly 3:14, the position indicator flicked from 0 to 11. Richard felt the hydraulic lines pulse through the concrete floor. The dam itself shuddered, a sound so low he felt it in his chest before his ears registered it. 4 minutes later, the indicator snapped back to 0 without so much as a relay click. He wasn't imagining it. The gate was moving. Richard reported the event again, this time with a detailed log and a demand for an inspection team. The utility dispatched 3 engineers the following week. They spent 6 days on site, replaced every sensor on Gate 4, tore down the hydraulic manifold, and even swapped out the SCADA controller card. Their final report ran 42 pages and concluded that all systems were functioning normally. The anomaly, they wrote, was consistent with a software timing error. Their recommendation was continued observation. One of the engineers, a young guy on his first field assignment, pulled Richard aside before they left. He said off the record that he'd never seen anything like it. The system simply wasn't built to do what the logs showed. He used the word impossible twice. That night after the engineers had flown out, Richard sat alone in the control room with the logbook open, and a feeling sinking into his stomach that he hadn't felt since he was 20 years old in the engine room of a destroyer, 300 feet underwater, with alarms screaming and no idea if he'd see the surface again. Something was wrong at Silver Creek, something the blueprints couldn't explain, and he decided right then that he was going to find out what it was. He started with a camera. An old GoPro he'd used to film motorcycle trips before his knees gave out. He mounted it in the lower gallery, aimed directly at Gate 4's hydraulic arm, and ran a cable back to a monitor he set up in his quarters. The camera recorded on a loop, overwriting every 24 hours unless he saved the file. The first night he watched live. At 3:10, he settled into his chair and fixed his eyes on the screen. The gallery was lit by a single overhead bulb. The hydraulic arm sat motionless, a thick steel rod painted industrial gray. Condensation dripped from the ceiling. The clock on the wall ticked toward 3:14, and then, as if an invisible hand had pressed the lever, the hydraulic arm began to extend. Smoothly, deliberately, the gate lifted, and the camera showed with perfect clarity that there was nobody in the gallery, no hands on the controls, no body blocking the light. Just the arm moving under a load of 14,000 pounds of water pressure. It opened exactly 11 inches. It held there for 4 minutes while Richard watched. His breath stopped, his hands frozen on the armrests. Then it closed. The arm retracted as if someone had reversed the current, and the gallery was silent again, save for the sound of Richard's own pulse hammering in his ears. He saved the footage. He watched it 17 times that night, frame by frame, looking for a rational explanation. He didn't find one. What he did find, buried in a filing cabinet in the dam's archive room, would change everything he thought he knew about Silver Creek, because the dam had a history, and that history was documented in a binder yellowed with age, stamped with a date that made his blood run cold. 1934. The year 11 men went into the diversion tunnel and never came out. The binder was buried in a steel cabinet in a room Richard had only entered twice before. The dam's archive space was little more than a concrete closet behind the turbine hall, filled with mildewed blueprints, yellowed maintenance logs, and boxes of invoices dating back to the Coolidge administration. He'd gone in looking for the original gate schematics, hoping to find some mechanical explanation the engineers had missed. Instead, he found a black leather binder with a spine so cracked it crumbled in his hands. The cover read, Silver Creek Hydroelectric Project Construction Incident Report, June 1934, internal use only. He opened it on the control room table under a single desk lamp. The first page was a typewritten memorandum from the project foreman, a man named Harold Stinson. The memo was dated June 18, 1934. It described, in the dry, bureaucratic language of the era, a catastrophic failure during the excavation of the diversion tunnel. The tunnel was designed to channel the river around the dam footprint while the main concrete structure was poured. On the night of June 17th, a section of tunnel roof collapsed approximately 240 feet from the upstream portal. 11 men were inside at the time. No survivors. Richard read that line 3 times. 11 men. The memo went on to detail the recovery efforts. Crews attempted to dig through the collapsed section, but the geology was unstable. The tunnel was carved through fractured basalt that kept crumbling. After 4 days of trying, the project engineers made a decision. The tunnel was declared a total loss. To maintain the construction schedule, they sealed the upstream and downstream portals with concrete plugs and rerouted the river through a new channel. The bodies of the 11 men were never recovered. They remained entombed in the sealed tunnel, somewhere inside the rock on which the dam now sat. Richard sat back in his chair. He rubbed his stubble and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the timing, 3:14 a.m. He hadn't made that connection yet, not consciously. The binder contained more. An appendix listed the names of the deceased. James Hartley, age 42, Thomas Crane, age 31, Peter Wallace, age 27. 8 others, most of them immigrants, most of them young, all of them working the overnight shift because that's when the pay differential kicked in. The foreman's memo noted that the collapse occurred at exactly 3:14 in the morning, based on the watch recovered from the only body they managed to extract before the tunnel was sealed. That body belonged to a surveyor who had been near the portal when the roof came down. He'd been crushed but identifiable. His pocket watch had stopped at 3:14. The time was verified by the night shift log and the seismograph recording from a station 30 miles away. The ground shook for 11 seconds. Then silence. Richard's eyes moved to a photograph clipped to the last page of the binder. It showed a brass plaque mounted on a concrete wall. The plaque was simple, just 11 names and a date. At the bottom, engraved in smaller script, was the time of the collapse, 3:14 a.m. The photograph was captioned Memorial Plaque, Lower Gallery West Wall. Richard had walked past that wall 1,000 times. He'd never noticed the plaque. It was tucked in a shadowed alcove near the Gate 4 maintenance access, a stretch of corridor so narrow you had to turn sideways to pass. The plaque was small, maybe 8 inches by 10, tarnished to the color of old pennies. Easy to miss, unless you were looking for it. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay in his cot with the binder open on his chest, running through the math in his head. 11 inches on Gate 4, 4 minutes of flow. At full reservoir head, that released approximately 725 cubic feet per second. Over 240 seconds, that came to roughly 174,000 cubic feet of water. Wait, he recalculated. 725 times 60 seconds is 43,500 cubic feet per minute, times 4 minutes. That's 174,000 cubic feet. But that didn't sound right for an 11-inch gate opening. He needed exact numbers. The next morning, Richard pulled the hydraulic calibration charts from the SCADA terminal. Gate 4 had an effective discharge coefficient of 0.68 at 11 inches of lift. The reservoir surface elevation that week was 2,312 feet above sea level, giving a net head of 148 feet. He did the math longhand, the way the Navy had taught him, filling 3 pages of a legal pad with formulas and unit conversions. The actual discharge was 698 cubic feet per second at that head and gate opening. Over 4 minutes, that came to 167,520 cubic feet. He circled the number. Next, he dug through the blueprints in the archive. He found the original diversion tunnel plans, dated 1931. The tunnel was a horseshoe section 12 feet wide by 14 feet high, with a total excavated length of 680 feet. The collapse had occurred at Station 240, meaning 240 feet from the upstream portal. Assuming the concrete plugs were poured at Station 200 and Station 280, the sealed chamber between them was approximately 80 feet long. Cross-sectional area was about 150 square feet. Multiply by 80 linear feet. 12,000 cubic feet. Not even close. Richard frowned. That couldn't be right. He'd expected the numbers to align. But 12,000 cubic feet was an order of magnitude smaller than the nightly discharge. He sat with the discrepancy for 3 days, running the calculations over and over, trying different gate coefficients, different reservoir levels, different collapse interpretations. Nothing matched. The water release was far larger than the void volume of the sealed tunnel. He almost convinced himself he was chasing a ghost, a coincidence, a pattern his tired brain had fabricated to make sense of something senseless. Then he found the second binder. It was in a different cabinet, labeled Silver Creek Expansion, Phase 2, 1936. The dam had been originally designed with a smaller reservoir, but in 1935, the utility decided to raise the spillway crest by 8 feet, expanding the impoundment capacity. That required lengthening the diversion tunnel and adding a secondary surge chamber off the main bore. The expansion plans showed a lateral excavation branching off the original tunnel at Station 255, a bulbous chamber 30 feet in diameter and 40 feet high, designed to absorb pressure transients during heavy flood releases. The chamber was never completed. Construction halted when the project budget ran dry in 1937. But the excavation was fully dug, and it connected directly to the original tunnel. The volume of the incomplete surge chamber, according to the engineering notes, was approximately 28,000 cubic feet. Add that to the tunnel collapse void and you had 40,000 cubic feet total. Still not enough. The nightly discharge was over 160,000 cubic feet. Richard's heart sank. He put the binders away and tried to forget the whole thing. But that night, sitting in the control room at 3:10 a.m. watching the clock, he realized his mistake. He'd been calculating the volume of the void itself, a static space, but the water wasn't filling a void. It was flowing through the gate. The number that mattered wasn't the volume of the chamber. It was the volume of water that, when released, dropped the reservoir surface elevation by a specific amount. That drop, the tiniest fraction of an inch, could be the key. He went back to the blueprints. The reservoir at Silver Creek covered 240 surface acres. 1 acre-foot of water is 43,560 cubic feet. So lowering the reservoir by 1 inch across 240 acres released approximately 871,200 cubic feet. That was far too large. His nightly release was a tiny fraction of that. But what if the number wasn't about the reservoir drawdown? What if it was about the volume of the sealed chamber plus the expansion void, but measured in a unit he hadn't considered? He reread the construction incident report one more time, and there it was. The collapse section wasn't 80 feet long. He'd misread the stationing. The cave-in had propagated from Station 240 all the way to Station 310, 70 feet, but the real detail was in a footnote. The tunnel had been partially flooded during the attempted rescue, and the water level stabilized at a depth of 4 feet before the decision was made to seal the portals. After sealing, the water inside the chamber slowly equalized with the surrounding groundwater, settling at a volume that was measured during a 1941 inspection as roughly 2,900 cubic feet of trapped water within the sealed void. 2,900 cubic feet. Richard stared at the number. He recalculated the Gate 4 discharge. 698 cubic feet per second times 240 seconds. 167,520 cubic feet. No, that was the total water passing the gate. But the nightly opening released additional water beyond what would normally pass through the turbines. The incremental release, the extra surge above baseline river flow, was the number that mattered. He subtracted the normal leakage and turbine bypass. The net surge downstream was, within measurement error, 2,900 cubic feet, exactly the volume of the water trapped in the sealed chamber, to within 2%. He checked it 6 times. He used 3 different flow models. He pulled historical SCADA data from the year before he arrived when the anomaly wasn't happening to establish the true baseline. The calculations were consistent. Every night at 3:14 a.m., Gate 4 released precisely the volume of water that had been sealed inside a collapsed tunnel in 1934, a tunnel containing the bodies of 11 men whose graves were the concrete walls themselves. Richard closed the binder and pressed his palms flat against the table. He understood now why the engineers had found nothing wrong with the system, because the system wasn't broken. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do. The gate was answering a command that didn't come from the control room. It came from somewhere else. That night he didn't watch from his quarters. He walked down to the lower gallery at 3:10 a.m., flashlight in hand, and stood in front of the brass memorial plaque. The names glinted dully in the beam. He traced his fingers over the engraved letters: James Hartley, Thomas Crane, Peter Wallace, the others. At 3:13, he heard the hydraulic lines pressurize. A low whine built in the walls around him. At exactly 3:14, the gate arm began to move. Richard stood 5 feet from it, watching the massive steel cylinder extend with a smooth, unstoppable purpose. Water thundered through the spillway chute, a roar so deep it seemed to come from inside his own bones. Mist filled the air. The gate held at 11 inches. 4 minutes passed. Then it closed. And in the sudden silence that followed, Richard heard something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A sound from behind the concrete wall, faint, rhythmic, like the tapping of a hammer against stone. 11 taps, then nothing. He went back the next night and the night after that. And on the 11th night, something new appeared on the gallery floor beneath the plaque. A small bunch of wildflowers tied with a piece of frayed rope, still wet with morning dew. Richard hadn't put them there. No one else had access to the gallery. He stood in the darkness, staring at the flowers, and he realized the truth. He wasn't just the dam's caretaker anymore. He was its witness. And whatever occupied the lower gallery at 3:14 in the morning had been waiting a very long time for someone to notice. The flowers changed everything for Richard. He'd been treating the gate anomaly as a mechanical problem, something to be solved with wrenches and diagnostic software and phone calls to engineers in Boise. But the flowers didn't come from a faulty solenoid. Someone or something had placed them there deliberately, and whoever did it had access to a part of the dam that was supposed to be sealed, monitored, and occupied by exactly one person. Richard was that person. He had the only keys. He logged every entry and exit. No helicopter had landed. No vehicle had approached. The access road was buried under 3 feet of snow. Yet the flowers were fresh, the stems still weeping sap where they'd been cut. He pressed them between the pages of the incident report binder and locked the archive room behind him. That week, Richard made a decision that separated him from every other dam operator the utility had ever employed. He stopped reporting, not out of fear, though fear was certainly part of it. He stopped reporting because he understood, with a clarity that had been building since the night he first watched the GoPro footage, that the utility didn't want to know. They had sent 6 engineers to investigate, and every single one of them had walked away calling it a software error. They'd seen the data. They'd watched the gate move, and their institutional response was to write a report that gave them permission to look away. Richard realized he was on his own. Whatever was happening at Silver Creek belonged to him now. He began keeping a separate journal, handwritten, stored in a Pelican case under his cot. He logged every nightly gate cycle, every unusual sound, every physical change in the lower gallery. The gate continued its pattern without fail. 3:14 in the morning, 11 inches, 4 minutes, 2,900 cubic feet. But as Richard's observations sharpened, he began to notice details he'd previously missed. The temperature in the lower gallery dropped by exactly 4 degrees during each cycle, regardless of the ambient air temperature outside. The overhead lights, powered by a dedicated circuit that was supposed to be isolated from the gate controls, dimmed momentarily at 3:13 and 58 seconds, 2 seconds before the hydraulic pump engaged. And the brass memorial plaque, which he now visited every night with the regularity of a churchgoer, was always warm to the touch, not hot, just slightly above ambient, as if someone had been standing there with their hand pressed against it moments before he arrived. He started arriving earlier, 3 o'clock, then 2:30, then 2 in the morning, sitting in the dark with his back against the cold concrete, waiting. He brought a digital audio recorder, the kind he'd used in the Navy to document engine room procedures. On the third night of recording, he captured something his ears hadn't registered in real time. A voice, or rather voices, plural. The playback revealed faint, overlapping murmurs that began at 3:13 and faded at 3:18, matching the gate cycle exactly. The words were indistinct, buried under the roar of water through the spillway chute, but the pattern was unmistakable. 11 distinct vocal signatures, 11 voices speaking simultaneously, each at a slightly different pitch, creating a harmonic drone that the microphone registered as a low-frequency resonance. Richard played the recording 17 times that night, the same way he'd done with the GoPro footage, trying to convince himself it was acoustic interference from the turbines. But the turbines ran at 60 hertz. The voices on the recording ranged from 85 to 220 hertz. They were human. He sent the audio file to a former Navy shipmate who now worked as a forensic acoustics analyst for a defense contractor in San Diego. The man owed Richard a favor from an incident neither of them ever spoke about. Richard didn't explain where the recording came from. He just asked for a clean analysis. 5 days later, the analyst emailed back with a report that made Richard set down his coffee and stare at the screen for a solid minute. The analyst had isolated and enhanced the vocal band. He'd identified 11 separate speakers, all male, estimated ages ranging from mid-20s to early 50s. The words were still hard to make out, but the software had extracted several phrases with high confidence. "Watch the roof," "Tell Mary," "The water's coming," and one phrase that repeated across multiple speakers, 11 inches. Richard read that line again. 11 inches. Those words had not appeared in any of his journals or reports. He'd never spoken them aloud to anyone, not even to Kellerman on the phone. The only place those words existed in connection to Gate 4 were in his handwritten notes, locked in a Pelican case under his cot, and in the dam's SCADA logs, which weren't connected to any external network. The utility engineers who'd visited hadn't used that phrase either. They'd referred to the gate displacement anomaly in their report. So how did 11 men who died in 1934 know the exact measurement of a gate opening that wouldn't exist for another 70 years? The question broke something in Richard's framework of reality. He'd always been a practical man. Machines made sense. Physics made sense. Even the paranormal in his Navy days had been something he could file away as unexplained but probably rational. But this was different. This wasn't a ghost story. This was a pattern with mathematical precision, a nightly ritual that obeyed the laws of hydraulics and simultaneously defied every law of nature he understood. The 11 men in the tunnel hadn't just died. They'd been sealed inside the structure, their bodies never recovered, their names reduced to a tarnished plaque in a forgotten corner of a dam nobody visited. And now every night the dam itself released exactly the volume of water that had filled their sealed tomb. Not a coincidence, not a software glitch, a message. Richard decided he needed to know more about the men, not just their names, but who they were, where they came from, who they'd left behind. The incident report had only the barest personnel details, so he started digging. He used the dam's satellite internet connection, painstakingly slow, to search newspaper archives from the 1930s. He found a brief article in the Idaho Statesman dated June 21, 1934, 3 days after the collapse. The headline read, "11 Lost in Silver Creek Tunnel Disaster, Rescue Efforts Abandoned." The article named all 11 men and included a detail the utility's internal report had omitted. The workers had been complaining for weeks about unstable conditions in the tunnel. 2 days before the collapse, a shift foreman named Michael Riordan had written a formal safety complaint, warning that the timber shoring was insufficient for the fractured basalt in the deep section. His complaint was denied by the project manager, Harold Stinson, who wrote in the margin, "Schedule priority. Proceed as planned." Riordan was one of the 11 men who died. Richard sat with that information for a long time. The men had known. They'd warned their bosses, and the bosses had sent them in anyway because the dam had to be finished on time, because the New Deal funding was contingent on meeting construction milestones, because 11 immigrant workers were replaceable and the schedule was not. The men had gone into the tunnel at 11 p.m. on June 17th, the overnight shift, the most dangerous shift, the one that paid 30 cents an hour instead of 25. 4 hours and 14 minutes later, the roof came down. Their bodies were still there, somewhere in the rock, sealed in by concrete plugs that were poured while the families were still waiting for news. But the story didn't end there. As Richard dug deeper into the newspaper archives, he found a follow-up article from 1938. 4 years after the collapse, a maintenance crew doing routine concrete inspection on the dam's downstream face had reported hearing knocking sounds from inside the structure, rhythmic tapping against stone. The article quoted a worker who said it sounded like men trying to get out. The utility investigated and issued a statement attributing the sounds to thermal expansion of the concrete. The report stopped after 1939, but the knocking never fully went away. A 56-year veteran of the dam, interviewed by a local historian in 1992, mentioned in passing that some of the old-timers refused to work the lower gallery at night. They said it was haunted. They said you could hear hammers if you listened close enough. The article was never published. The historian's notes ended up in a library archive in Boise, digitized 2 decades later, where Richard found them on page 17 of a PDF scan. The knocking, the 11 taps he'd heard that night after the gate closed. It wasn't his imagination. It wasn't air in the pipes. It was a pattern that had been repeating for over 80 years, witnessed by dozens of men who'd worked at Silver Creek across 3 generations, all of whom had kept quiet because admitting it would mean admitting the dam was built on more than just rock. It was built on a decision to leave 11 men behind and pretend they'd never existed. Richard printed the articles. He laid them out across the control room floor, forming a timeline that stretched from 1934 to the present day. He added his own observations, the gate data, the temperature readings, the audio analysis. The picture that emerged was not one he wanted to see. The nightly gate cycle wasn't random. It wasn't even supernatural in the way ghost stories usually were. It was purposeful. The volume of water released matched the volume of the sealed chamber. The timing matched the moment of death. The voices repeated phrases that the dead men might have said in their final moments, and the phrase 11 inches suggested an awareness of the mechanism through which the message was being sent. It was as if the men, or whatever consciousness remained of them, understood exactly how the dam worked and were using it to communicate. They weren't just haunting Silver Creek. They were operating it. Richard stopped leaving the dam. He'd always been a solitary man, but this was different. He stopped flying out for his monthly supply runs. He told Kellerman he preferred to stay on site year-round, that he'd handle his own provisioning through a mail drop at the trailhead. The utility didn't argue. They were happy to save the helicopter fuel. Richard's world contracted to the concrete walls of Silver Creek, the rhythmic hum of the turbines, and the nightly pilgrimage to the lower gallery. He learned the names of all 11 men by heart. He recited them sometimes, standing before the plaque in the dark like a roll call, Hartley and Crane and Wallace and Riordan and the others. He brought flowers when he could find them, wild clumps of lupin and paintbrush that grew along the canyon rim. He placed them beneath the plaque, and they were always gone by morning, not scattered, not wilted, just gone. And then in his 4th year, Richard discovered the final piece. The thing that would make him seal the lower gallery himself and tell the utility never to send another living soul down there. He found it in an old survey map that had been folded inside the back cover of the incident report binder, a page so thin and brittle he nearly destroyed it just unfolding it. The map showed the original tunnel alignment overlaid with the dam's finished footprint. It illustrated something the utility had never included in any official documentation. The sealed chamber, the tomb of the 11 men, was not located where Richard had assumed. It wasn't in the rock off to the side of the dam. It was directly beneath Gate 4. The concrete plug that sealed the downstream portal of the tunnel was less than 3 feet from the spillway discharge chute. Every time Gate 4 opened, the water that thundered through the chute passed within arm's reach of the tomb. The chamber hadn't been sealed away from the dam. It had been incorporated into it. The men were inside the structure. They'd always been inside the structure. And the gate that opened every night at 3:14 in the morning was their way of saying they were still there. Richard sat on the cold floor of the archive room with the survey map spread across his knees and a truth settling into him like concrete curring in his chest. The 11 men were not somewhere in the general geology beneath the dam. They were directly under Gate 4. The downstream portal plug was less than 36 inches from the spillway chute wall. Every time the gate opened, the water that screamed through that chute passed within arm's reach of the chamber where 11 bodies had been entombed for over 80 years. The gate was not just a mechanism, it was a voice. And Richard was the only person who had ever stopped long enough to listen. He spent the next several weeks trying to make contact. Not in the passive way he had been doing, sitting in the dark and waiting for evidence to accumulate. He wanted to communicate. He brought the audio recorder down to the gallery every night and set it up on a tripod facing the plaque. He spoke aloud into the silence, asking questions he never imagined he would ask a concrete wall. Who are you? What do you want? Why 11 inches? The responses, when they came, were embedded in the low-frequency hum that filled the gallery during the gate cycle. His analyst friend in San Diego ran the enhanced audio through a new processing algorithm and sent back transcriptions that were clearer than anything they had captured before. The voices now formed complete sentences. We have been waiting. We are still here. Do not forget us. The analyst called Richard on the satellite phone and asked, in a voice that was half professional curiosity and half genuine fear, what kind of classified operation Richard was involved in. Richard told him it was just an old dam. The analyst did not believe him. On the 1-year anniversary of his first gate observation, Richard made a decision. He would not let the men stay forgotten any longer. He compiled everything. The SCADA logs, the GoPro footage, the audio recordings, the historical research, the blueprints, the incident report, the newspaper clippings, the survey map. He organized it into a file that ran over 200 pages, and he mailed it via the Trailhead Dropbox to a journalist in Boise who had written about industrial accidents in the Pacific Northwest. He included a cover letter that began, "My name is Richard Calloway. I am the sole operator at Silver Creek Dam. 11 men died here in 1934, and their bodies are still inside the structure. I have evidence that they are trying to communicate. Please help me tell their story." The journalist, a woman named Diane Marsh, called him 2 weeks later. She had spent her career covering the hidden costs of American infrastructure, the workers who died building the highways and bridges and dams that everyone took for granted. She told Richard that if his documentation was authentic, this was the biggest story she had ever encountered. Richard assured her it was authentic. He had 17 nights of video, 41 audio samples, and a paper trail stretching back to the Hoover administration. Diane said she would come to Silver Creek. Richard told her that was impossible. The access road was gone. The only way in was a 14-mile hike through bare country or a helicopter flight approved by the utility. Diane said she would find a way. She did. 3 weeks later, in the middle of a rainstorm that turned the canyon into a waterfall, a helicopter landed on the dam's upper maintenance pad. Diane Marsh stepped out, followed by a cameraman and a civil engineer she had hired as a consultant. Richard met them at the pad, a gaunt figure in worn coveralls, his eyes hollow from too many nights in the gallery. He led them inside and showed them everything: the control room, the SCADA terminal, the archive binders, the GoPro footage, the audio files, the memorial plaque. And that night at 3:14 in the morning, they stood together in the lower gallery and watched Gate 4 open 11 inches with no human hand anywhere near it. The engineer checked every gauge, every relay, every hydraulic line. He found nothing. The cameraman recorded the entire event, the gate arm extending into the darkness, the water roaring through the chute, the temperature dropping, the lights dimming. And when the gate closed 4 minutes later, Diane Marsh was crying. She had spent 20 years writing about dead workers, and she had never once felt their presence. Now she did. The story broke 6 weeks later. Diane's article filled the entire Sunday edition of the Idaho Statesman and was syndicated to national outlets. The headline read, "The Dam That Won't Forget. 11 men lost in 1934 still haunt remote hydroelectric station." The article included photographs of the memorial plaque, excerpts from the incident report, and a detailed explanation of the gate anomaly with the precise volume calculations Richard had done. It quoted the acoustic analysis and included a sidebar from a paranormal researcher who called it the most mathematically verifiable haunting in recorded history. The utility issued a statement within 24 hours. They called the article speculative and irresponsible. They said there was no evidence of any paranormal activity at Silver Creek, and that the gate anomaly had been fully explained as a software timing error. They declined to comment on the 11 bodies still entombed in the dam, but the public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Descendants of the 11 men came forward. A grandson of James Hartley, now in his 70s, told a television news crew that his grandmother had never stopped believing her husband was buried in that dam, that she had written letters to the utility for 40 years and never received a single reply. A great-niece of Michael Riordan, the foreman who had filed the safety complaint, produced the original carbon copy of that complaint, which had been passed down through the family as a relic of injustice. The families demanded that the utility acknowledge what had happened, that the bodies be recovered or properly memorialized, and that the gate anomaly be investigated by independent experts. The utility responded by going silent. For 3 weeks, they issued no further statements. And then, without warning, they announced that Silver Creek Dam would be temporarily shut down for structural reinforcement of the lower gallery, citing seismic concerns that had nothing to do with the news coverage. Richard knew what was coming. He had spent enough years inside the machinery of a large organization to recognize the shape of a cover-up. The utility was not going to recover the bodies. They were not going to admit negligence. They were going to pour concrete, a lot of it. They were going to seal the lower gallery so completely that no one would ever see the plaque or hear the gate or stand in the presence of the 11 men again. They were going to bury the evidence, literally and figuratively, and pretend the whole thing had never happened. The engineering crew arrived on a Monday morning in early October. 10 men, 3 trucks of equipment, and enough industrial-grade concrete to fill a swimming pool. The foreman, a square-jawed man named Grady, handed Richard a work order that authorized the complete sealing of the lower gallery access corridor, the reinforcement of the Gate 4 maintenance shaft, and the installation of a steel bulkhead between the turbine hall and the historic tunnel section. The order was signed by 3 regional directors. Richard had no authority to refuse. He was, on paper, just the caretaker. He watched them work for 2 days. The jackhammers and the cement mixers and the welding torches. The men were efficient and professional. They did not ask why they were sealing a perfectly functional gallery. They did not read the plaque. They did not notice the flowers that had appeared that morning, fresh lupin tied with frayed rope, resting against the base of the memorial. Richard noticed. He noticed everything. And on the second night, when the crew had retired to their trailers and the dam was quiet again, he went down to the gallery one last time before it was sealed forever. The concrete forms were already in place. The bulkhead frame was bolted to the walls. The access corridor had maybe 8 hours left before it became a solid wall of steel and stone. Richard stood before the plaque with his flashlight and read the names aloud one final time. James Hartley, Thomas Crane, Peter Wallace, Michael Riordan. The 7 others. He told them he was sorry. He told them he had tried. He told them they would not be forgotten. And then at 3:14 in the morning, the gate opened. The hydraulic arm extended. The water thundered through the chute. And Richard heard, clearly for the first time with his own unaided ears, 11 voices speaking in unison. They said 2 words. Thank you. The gate closed. The gallery fell silent. And Richard knew with absolute certainty that the cycle was over. The men had not been trying to escape. They had not been trying to haunt anyone. They had simply been waiting for someone to acknowledge that they existed, that they had lived, that they had died building something that people used every day without ever thinking about the cost. Richard had acknowledged them. The world now knew their names, and that, it seemed, was enough. The next morning, the crew finished the ceiling. Concrete filled the corridor. The steel bulkhead was welded shut. The lower gallery became a closed tomb within a tomb. The utility issued a final report declaring the structural reinforcement complete and the Gate 4 anomaly resolved. They never mentioned the bodies. They never mentioned the men. But Richard knew the truth. And so did the families. And so did everyone who had read Diane Marsh's article or seen the news coverage or heard the audio recordings that circulated online for years afterward. Richard still works at Silver Creek Dam. He is 61 years old now, his hair completely gray, his hands gnarled from 16 years of turning brass keys and maintaining machinery that should have been retired decades ago. The lower gallery is sealed behind a bulkhead that no one will ever open, but the gate still runs, not at 3:14 anymore. The nightly cycle stopped the moment the sealing was complete, as if the purpose had been fulfilled. But Richard still goes down to the access corridor every night. He stands outside the bulkhead and listens. Sometimes, if he presses his ear against the steel, he can hear a faint tapping, 11 taps, regular as a heartbeat. And every Sunday, when the helicopter delivers his supplies, he walks the canyon rim and gathers wildflowers. He leaves them at the bulkhead door. By morning, they are always gone. He says it is the only thing that still gets flowers. And he intends to keep bringing them until the day he joins the 11 men on the other side of the wall. What happened at Silver Creek is not a ghost story. It is a story about memory, about what happens when the people who build the world are erased from it. 11 men died inside that dam. Their bodies were never recovered. Their names were etched on a plaque so small it took Richard 8 decades to find it. And for all those years they waited, not for revenge, not for terror, for acknowledgement. The most unsettling detail in Richard's entire archive is not the gate opening on its own. It is not the voices on the audio recording or the flowers that appeared and disappeared. It is the math. 11 inches of gate lift, 4 minutes of flow, 2,900 cubic feet of water released every single night, a volume that matched the sealed tomb to within 2%. That number was not a coincidence. It was a signature. Something inside that dam was operating the machinery with a precision that human engineers could not explain and did not want to. And when the utility finally sealed the lower gallery, they were not fixing a structural problem. They were silencing a message they had ignored for 80 years. But here is the thing about messages that true. Once they are heard, they do not go away. Richard's documentation still exists. Diane Marsh's article is still archived. The families of James Hartley and Thomas Crane and Peter Wallace and Michael Riordan and the 7 others finally know what happened to their ancestors. And somewhere in the dark behind a steel bulkhead, 11 men whose names are finally spoken aloud rest a little easier than they did before. Richard still puts on his coveralls every morning and walks the galleries of Silver Creek Dam. He says he will retire when the turbines stop turning. He says the dam is in his blood now, the same way it was in theirs. And every Sunday, without fail, he gathers wildflowers from the canyon rim and places them at the door of the sealed gallery. He knows they will be gone by morning. He knows where they go. And he knows with a certainty that has nothing to do with logic or engineering that the 11 men are still there, waiting, watching, grateful. If you drive far enough into the backcountry of Idaho, past the last paved road and the last Forest Service sign, you might find the canyon where Silver Creek Dam sits. You will not be able to reach it. The road is washed out. The gate is locked. But if you stand on the rim at 3:14 in the morning when the world is silent except for the rush of water through the spillway, you might hear something that sounds like tapping. 11 taps against stone. And now you will know what it means. Thanks for watching. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. We have more true stories from the most remote and unexplained places on Earth. See you in the next one.